For 5 years during World War II, Norway endured occupation by the Nazis. And throughout the war, resistance by relatively small numbers of brave men and women operating in the bleak and mountainous countryside tied down more than 350,000 German troops. Theirs was a war of small actions and narrow escapes. The threat of capture, torture, and death was constant. Many acts of heroism went unreported, while the Germans were kept under constant surveillance and threat of attack. On at least one occasion, their sabotage operations could be said to have changed the course of history by destroying a vital ingredient for the development of a Nazi atomic bomb. Right to the end, Hitler remained convinced that the Allies would invade Norway, and he never allowed the troops there to be moved to battlefronts where they were desperately needed. The gladiators of the Norwegian resistance played a little-known but nonetheless vital part in ensuring Allied victory. At the beginning of World War II, Norway declared her neutrality. But her geographical position meant that she was in an awkward political situation. Well before the war, the Germans had been using the northern Norwegian port of Narvik to bring out vital iron ore from northern Sweden. When the Soviet Union attacked Finland in November 1939, Norway's position became even more precarious. For the Finns fought off the initial Soviet attacks, and Britain and France wanted to send support to help them against a country then allied to Nazi Germany. They planned to use Narvik for this, but on the 13th of March 1940, just as the Allies finalized their plans, the Finns surrendered. The excuse for British and French intervention had gone, but in the meantime the Germans had also been plotting. In October 1939, Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, head of the German Navy, had proposed to Hitler that bases be seized in Norway to help in the naval war against Britain. At the end of January 1940, Hitler was finally convinced and took personal charge of planning the invasion of Norway. The Germans struck at both Norway and Denmark on the 9th of April. They made seaborne landings at most of Norway's major ports, while paratroops seized the airfield at Stavanger. Within hours, German troops were in control of Oslo, and King Haakon VII and his government had been forced to flee northwards. The Allies countered with landings in the north, aiming to drive the Germans out of Narvik and to seize ports further south. They wanted to help the Norwegian troops trying to hold up the German advance, but the Luftwaffe proved decisive, and the Allies were forced to fall back. By early May, the only Allied forces left in Norway were those which had driven the Germans out of Narvik. And these were also withdrawn when the German blitzkrieg overwhelmed France. King Haakon and his government left with them and set up a Norwegian government in exile. His broadcast to his occupied country helped to show that all was not lost. While the Germans installed a Reichskommissar and a puppet Norwegian government under Vidkun Quisling, who had formed the neo-Nazi National Unity Party before the war. A large German garrison was deployed, but But in contrast to those in many other occupied countries, its behavior was less harsh. Nevertheless, resistance in Norway soon began, with the king's name forming a symbol of defiance. At first, it was small local groups, but grew steadily into a nationwide organization, Milorg. Its leaders decided to prepare to support an eventual Allied invasion, but that any premature sabotage would put the population at too much risk. Other Norwegians were determined to get away and take a more active part in the war. Many, like Lars Ronneberg, escaped by small boat across the North Sea to Britain.
When I left Norway in March 41, I went by a fishing boat. It was a boat of about 50 feet, ordinary fishing vessel. And I went together with 6, 7 other Norwegians. And our area was pretty easy to leave because it was not what the Germans called prohibited area.
After landing and being screened to ensure that they weren't spies, many joined the conventional Free Norwegian forces. But others were recruited as agents by less conventional British organizations like SOE, the Special Operations Executive, or the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS. Their instructors, such as Colonel Charles Hampton, found them enthusiastic, but not always very careful.
It's security, which is one of the main things we had to teach Norwegians, because they were a little naive when they came first, and, you know, they rather took the line when you chased them on an exercise, and you surprised them. Of course, we wouldn't do that in Norway, because this is the very thing we said, well, you've got to do it here, I mean, so you don't do it in Norway.
Nevertheless, on the 5th of September 1940, a fishing boat set off back to Norway from Scotland. On board were 4 Norwegian radio operators who had been trained by the SIS. Their aim was to set up radio stations in Trondheim and Oslo to send intelligence back to Britain. The radio spies' first attempts to establish contact with Britain failed, but soon station Skylark B in Trondheim began to send back a steady stream of information. Within a few months, this enabled the Royal Navy to win a vital victory. The relative ease with which fishing boats could slip to and from the long coastline of Nazi-occupied Norway meant that the route soon became known as the Shetland Bus. It operated in all weathers for the next 5 years, with trips virtually every week. None of the agents sent in, like Olaf Reed Olsen, had any illusions about the risks they were running.
The other guys wouldn't. They had the same wish that if anyone was hurt, we should shoot him. Just think what would happen to any one of us being caught.
Steadily, the number of ports under constant observation increased. The timing of convoys was passed back to the Royal Air Force. Visits were then arranged. The radio spies' first major coup came on the 22nd of May 1941, when they reported the arrival of 3 German destroyers at Trondheim. This was a crucial message for the British Admiralty. It knew that the German battleship Bismarck, accompanied by the cruiser Prince Eugen and a destroyer escort, had entered the North Sea from the Baltic. air reconnaissance had shown that they had put into the Norwegian port of Bergen. But poor weather meant that the British could not tell whether the ships had left again. The radio spy's message confirmed that Bismarck had left her escorts and was at sea once more, trying to slip out to ravage the convoy routes in the North Atlantic. The home fleet was deployed, and 5 days later, Germany's most powerful warship was brought to bay and sunk. In March 1941, British commandos mounted a highly successful raid on the Lofoten Islands. The German response was to destroy houses and arrest a number of prominent local people. 70 were sent to a concentration camp in Norway, and Milorg made clear that it considered this too high a price to pay for the success of the raid. The Norwegian government in exile was also angry at not having been informed of the raid beforehand, but it was wary of giving Milorg total support for fear that it intended to set up an alternative government in Norway after the war. Aware of growing resistance, German restrictions increased. And in July, a state of emergency was declared by the Reichskommissar. The following month, the Germans confiscated all radios in the country. Milorg responded by producing underground newspapers based on BBC World Service broadcasts to Norway. During the autumn, an agreement was reached bringing Milorg under government control as part of the armed forces. The military importance of Norway was radically increased in June 1941, when Hitler launched his invasion of the Soviet Union. Within weeks, the first convoys had sailed from Britain to take military assistance to its new ally. And German air and naval attacks on this vital lifeline built up steadily. The general feeling of crisis was kept on the boil at the end of 1941 by further major British commando raids on the Lofoten Islands and the port of Vagsø. Winston Churchill was keen to follow up with an invasion of Norway. Although the British chiefs of staff managed to dissuade the Prime Minister, Adolf Hitler had also decided that Norway would be a vital theatre of war. The garrison was steadily built up until more than 350,000 German troops were stationed in the country. Milorg increased its sabotage operations to keep them occupied. For the Norwegian resistance, one of the most important developments came in early 1942, when Hitler ordered the major surviving units of his surface fleet to northern Norway. The battleship Tirpitz, Bismarck's sister, led the deployment, and the threat she posed to the Russian convoys became a major concern for British planners. Monitoring the whereabouts of the German fleet in the distant and isolated fjords became the main task of the Norwegian radio spies. Their surveillance activities were expanded, with radio stations along the length of Norway's 2,000-mile coastline. The activity of the Shetland bus increased, and men such as Bjorn Råholt often had to take appalling risks to get into restricted areas.
Getting a radio transmitter installed at the German-held Agnes fortress, of course, was a bit of a headache. But it was solved in this way that I was fitted out as an insurance salesman with false papers, which the only correct thing about it was it said agent on it. And I simply took the coastal steamer out to the Agnes fortress and walked off the steamer and straight up to the commandant's office. And I explained to him that I had arrived that morning from Oslo on the night train, and I simply did not have time to get the special papers which were necessary to be permitted to enter the fortress. And here are my credentials, and would he please give his personal permission for me to go around and see my Norwegian clients. And he jokingly asked me if I wanted to make an insurance policy for him, and I told him that no, as a matter of principle, we never take risks on German naval officers, and he thought this was a huge joke, and he gave me his permission. We then parted, and I went to see the very brave man, Magne Hassel, who had promised to operate the transmitter.
For almost 3 years, the German ships were tracked as they moved from hiding place to hiding place. Meanwhile, there was a major crackdown on Milorg by the Gestapo and Abwehr. Informers were successfully infiltrated, and by mid-1942, Milorg had virtually ceased to exist in southern Norway. German countermeasures and searches threatened the radio spies as well. Olaf Reed Olsen and his team had a lucky escape. Only hours after this photograph was taken, they found themselves fleeing for their lives.
All around the district, they've circled the whole thing with close to 600 men. And we ran then from one machine gun post into another one constantly. And of course they started firing like mad, and then we had these running patrols after us. And if we hadn't had a physical condition that we did have, of course we'd never make it. As I always said to the boys, that we are the boss. No Germans can outwit us when it comes to the woods. While the Germans and the police cars were running all the time up and down the valley, we took the ordinary bus in to town. Went through troop control, had our papers, nobody said a word. So by doing what they didn't think we would do, certainly saved us that time.
In a desperate attempt to destroy the Gestapo's records, RAF Mosquitoes made a daring low-level attack on its headquarters in Oslo on the 25th of September 1942. One bomb struck home, but failed to explode. While the resistance war was hotting up, Allied intelligence had become aware of another threat. One which had the potential to win the war for Hitler. Deep in the bleak Telemark region, 70 miles west of Oslo, was the town of Rjukan. Disturbing reports were being received that the hydroelectric plant at nearby Vermork was playing a crucial role in Germany's race to develop an atomic bomb. As a byproduct, the plant produced heavy water, deuterium oxide, a vital element to control nuclear reactions within a laboratory. Without this, German research would grind to a halt, and spies reported that the Norsk hydro factory had been ordered to step up production urgently. The information landed on the desk of Lieutenant Commander Erik Welsh, who was in charge of the Norwegian section of British intelligence. It was decided that the situation must be assessed, and that the first step was to get someone into the factory who had a knowledge of the plant and the technical background to monitor exactly what was happening. The ideal man was soon found. Einar Skinnaland had recently escaped to Britain. He came from the Rjukan area and was a hydroelectric technician. He was also an expert skier and amateur radio operator. After hurried briefings, Skinnar Land was dropped back into Norway on the night of the 29th of March 1942. He managed to get a job with a construction team at the Norsk hydro plant, and his report soon made it clear that the production of heavy water must be disrupted. British intelligence was instructed to do so. A four-man team was chosen from Norwegian volunteers, among them Jens Anton Poulsen, who later became a general in the Norwegian army.
We were called into Colonel Wilson's office, I remember, and he gave us the outline of the operation and so on. But the thing I remember is that he told us that if the Germans get hold of the heavy water, or he didn't know what they were using it for, but if they get hold of it, they would be able to blow up the whole of London.
The team, codenamed the Swallows, was infiltrated by parachute into the Telemark area in October 1942. They would guide the main group of paratroop engineers who would arrive by glider. Once the team reached Ryukan, they contacted Skinnar Land, who warned them that the Germans had recently reinforced the guard at the plant. The Swallows informed London of this, but the glider operation went ahead. Two gliders, each with 17 engineers, took off from Wick Airfield in the extreme north of Scotland on the 19th of November 1942. Operation Freshman was a disaster. Both gliders crashed, and the survivors were shot by the Germans after a brief interrogation. It was not until after the war that their bodies were exhumed and the full details of the mass murder were revealed. The four Swallows, isolated and short of food, went to ground. They must survive through the bitter winter until another attempt could be made on the plant. On the bleak Hardanger Plateau in Telemark, the four-man team managed to avoid detection throughout the winter. Klaus Hellberg remembers the extremes they were reduced to.
We hadn't much food left, so we were anxious. I remember we started digging into the snow to get moss.
SOE now took over planning for another attempt to sabotage the Norsk hydro plant. It would be codenamed Operation Gunnerside. Lieutenant Joachim Ronneberg, one of the Norwegian section's most experienced officers, was chosen to lead it.
And then I was told that we were going to Vemork to blow up this heavy water factory. And we were also told about the trial which had been done already by British commanders with the two gliders. And we were told about the little group of Norwegians who had been back in Norway as a reception committee.
Ronneberg selected 5 expert skiers, and they trained in Scotland using a mock-up of the plant. On the 23rd of January 1943, the new team took off by bomber to be dropped on the Hardanger Plateau, where the Swallows were waiting for them. The first attempt failed, because the bomber crew could not spot the lights of the reception party. Ronneberg and his men had to wait for the next full moon to try again. This time, on the 16th of February, the drop went well. But high winds took them away from the landing zone, and it took several anxious hours to locate the Swallows.
Never forget that meeting. Oh yeah, marvelous. Heard someone shouting, "Hello!" And that was one of the men, and we were, of course, was very, very happy. And then we saw the others. They had been hiding.
The Norsk hydro plant stood on the side of a precipitous gorge. The only approach across this was a bridge, but this was closely guarded, as were the slopes above the factory. However, the Germans seemed to think that the gorge was impassable. Klaus Hellberg went to investigate.
I found a way down to the gorge, rather steep, but not too difficult. I crossed the river and up on the other side. It wasn't so difficult. We could get down in daylight. It would, of course, be a little more difficult in nighttime.
He then returned to the hut and explained the two possibilities.
We voted about it, and I think 5 or 6 were for the gorge, and the others for the bridge. The 2 officers, they were for the bridge, but we decided to use the gorge.
They started about 8 o'clock in the evening. It was dark. We crossed the gorge with weapons and demolitions.
Shortly after midnight, they approached the perimeter fence of the plant. To their amazement, they spotted no sentries and were able to cut the single chain and padlock without difficulty. Although they could hear voices from a guardhouse, they reached the heavy water production plant unseen and broke in. The charges were laid. Two-minute fuses were then lit. And the saboteurs slipped out into the darkness, still undetected. The heavy water cells and storage tanks were totally destroyed. And even General Nikolaus von Falkenhorst, the German military commander in Norway, had to admit that it was the most spectacular coup he had ever heard of. Thousands of his men scoured the area, but most of the sabotage team got away to Sweden. None were caught, even though sometimes it was a close-run thing. The remainder, including Klaus Hellberg, stayed behind to plan further raids. A few weeks later, as he approached one of the supposedly safe houses, he momentarily let down his guard.
I was relaxed. I was glad to be by myself. So I loved it. The sun, good skiing conditions. When I got there, I saw lots of ski tracks outside the hut, and I was rather suspicious. Why are there so many ski tracks? Then from the hut, I saw Germans. The Germans had discovered this particular hut. I ran as fast as I possibly could into my skis and ran off. And then the Germans started shouting and shooting. I thought this is the end. Two men managed to keep on and chased me. After a while, there was only one. The only thing I thought was, you have to be faster, even faster, to get away. When I was skiing uphill, I was faster. When skiing downhill, he was faster. In the long downhill, he was quite close to me. I took my pistol gun, shot 2 shots, didn't hit. And he started shooting at me. He didn't hit me. And when he had no more shots, he turned as quickly as he could. I sent him 2 shots here and away, and I had escaped.
Operation Gunnerside was an enormous boost to Norwegian morale, but within 3 months, the Germans had repaired the plant and production of heavy water began again. In November, the US 8th Air Force bombed the plant. It was not hit, although the town of Ryukan was damaged. But the attack persuaded the Germans that heavy water production at Norsk Hydro should be abandoned and the remaining stocks shipped back to Germany. London was told of this by Einar Skinnerland, and it was decided that the stocks must not be allowed to reach the Reich. Knut Haukelid, one of the Norsk Hydro team who had stayed behind, was chosen to carry out the operation. Because of the danger of civilian casualties, his instructions came from the highest level.
And it ended up with a definite order to do it. I know for certain that it was taken up in a Norwegian cabinet meeting. And the order was to sink it at any cost.
The only way the Germans could get the heavy water from the plant was by railway, but the train was too heavily guarded to make an attack on it feasible during its journey. The railway wagons were then parked to be loaded on a ferry the next morning to take them across Lake Tinsjø. That evening, the wagons were closely watched by German troops. But they had forgotten to guard the ferry, and Haukelid seized his opportunity.
We just walked aboard the ferry in the middle of the night, got around the Norwegian watchman who was there, and went down into the villages and laid a delayed charge which would sink the ferry.
Next day, the 20th of February 1944, the heavy water wagons were shunted on board. The ferry set sail. And as it approached the deepest part of the lake, the ferry sank within 5 minutes, taking all the heavy water wagons with it. It was the end of Hitler's dream of building an atomic bomb. Throughout the operations against Hitler's atomic plans, the radio spies continued to monitor the movements of German warships in Norwegian waters. The battleship Tirpitz remained their major target. And during 1942, the RAF made a number of bombing attacks on the ship. None was successful in damaging her. That autumn, Tirpitz was based in a fjord near Trondheim. The Royal Navy now came up with an ingenious plan to attack her using their new chariots, torpedoes with a 2-man crew, and a removable warhead. To get the chariots close enough to their target, they would be transported by one of the fishing boats of the Shetland bus, the Arthur. In command was one of the Norwegian Navy's most experienced skippers, Leif Larsen. The Arthur set out from the Shetlands in October, with 2 chariots lashed to the deck and their Royal Navy crews hidden below. Before reaching the entrance to Trondheim Fjord, the chariots were lowered into the sea and towed below the Arthur. As they proceeded up the 75-mile fjord, a German patrol boat stopped and searched Larsen's vessel. His forged papers passed scrutiny, and the Arthur continued towards Trondheim. But when they were less than 10 miles from their target, the Arthur was hit by a sudden squall. The chariots broke their tow and were lost. All Larsen could do was scuttle his boat and set off by foot for Sweden. All but one of the party eventually made it back to Britain. Undaunted, the radio spies continued to report on the Tirpitz and the other German warships in Norwegian waters. And using their information, another attempt to cripple the Tirpitz was made in autumn 1943, this time using midget submarines called X-craft. These succeeded in damaging her, and the radio spies told London that she would be out of commission for 6 months. A few weeks later, their efforts were again rewarded. On Christmas Day 1943, the battle cruiser Scharnhorst sailed from Altenfjord, and a signal from the radio spies alerted the British home fleet. Scharnhorst was cornered while trying to attack a convoy off the North Cape and sunk. Despite the disastrous sinking of the Scharnhorst, 1944 opened well for the large German garrison in Norway. Conditions were relaxed, a far cry from the appalling defeats the Reich had suffered in Russia and the Mediterranean. But their Führer remained convinced that Norway would be an Allied invasion target, and as the date for their landing in France drew nearer, the Allies were determined to keep him thinking that way. As part of Operation Fortitude, the elaborate deception plan to keep the Germans guessing about D-Day, radio trucks toured the Scottish Highlands broadcasting the radio traffic of a fictitious army preparing to land in Norway. The German garrison remained at full strength, even as the Allied troops boarded their landing craft for Normandy. As they did so, the Norwegian radio spies were given a new and urgent job. For the Allied landing was being threatened by storms sweeping in from the Atlantic. Information about the weather patterns in Norway was urgently needed to predict whether D-Day could go ahead. By now, Olaf Reed Olsen was a much wanted man, with many aliases and a substantial price on his head. But he was still in the field, and had even managed to plug his secret transmitter into part of the national electric grid.
We had a message saying that please send weather reports every hour. Well, it started every second hour and then every hour.
This was done. The radio spies found it a tedious task. But the reason why the information was so desperately needed soon became clear.
The weather reports was a pain in the neck. Anyway, we were sitting listening to the news, and then suddenly we heard the invasion was on.
The radio spies had played a vital part in building up the picture of a brief lull between the unseasonal storms, which enabled General Eisenhower to give the go-ahead for the D-Day landings after a nail-biting 24-hour delay.
So we were very proud to have sent weather reports.
As the Allied troops built up their bridgehead in Normandy and began to drive the Germans back, the pressure was kept up in Norway to prevent any of the garrison from being moved south. The air attacks on coastal convoys increased. And the Norwegian motor torpedo boat flotilla based at Lerwick in the Shetlands began to use more aggressive tactics. The crews made frequent crossings of the North Sea. On reaching Norway, they would hide up in a fjord. The crews became expert at camouflaging their boats. Local resistance men told them of shipping movements and provided other information about enemy activity. Attacks from these hidden bases added to the pressure on the Germans. But Tirpitz remained in being, and the radio spies monitored the series of carrier-borne air attacks made on her during the spring and summer of 1944. They were able to tell London that even though the Fleet Air Arm planes scored hits, they were not sufficient to knock out the German battleship. Finally, in November 1944, Tirpitz was struck by RAF Lancaster bombers, using 12,000-pound Torboy bombs. She rolled over and sank. A threat that had obsessed the Royal Navy for almost 3 years was ended. The destruction of the beast, as Churchill called Tirpitz, could not have been achieved without the intelligence provided by the Norwegian radio spies. But all the while, the Norwegians were only too aware that the Allied strategy was a direct advance into Germany across northwest Europe. The Nazi forces in Norway would be left to wither on the vine. There would be no direct help for the resistance until German forces elsewhere surrendered. Milorg increased its sabotage campaign. One of their more imaginative projects was to contaminate fish bound for Germany. Nevertheless, the war did come closer to Norway in the autumn of 1944, when German forces in Finland began to withdraw through the far north of Norway, hotly pursued by the Russians. As the Germans withdrew, they laid waste to the area. A force of 350 Norwegians was sent from Britain to join the Russians and ensure that the inhabitants of the liberated area were not maltreated. With the end of the fighting in Europe in May 1945, Milorg's moment finally came. Its 60,000 members took the surrender of the German garrison, now swollen to 365,000 men. A single Norwegian in civilian clothes and wearing an armband took the surrender of the German garrison of Oslo. And British airborne forces were quickly deployed to Norway to help disarm the Germans. were greeted by ecstatic crowds. It had been a hard and frustrating 5 years. Much of the work of the resistance in Norway had been a secret and unglamorous war of the shadows. But the intelligence provided by the radio spies and the efforts of the Norwegian Special Forces and the gallant men and women of Milorg ensured that Norway played a substantial part in the ultimate Allied victory.